Thanks, Jeanette. All right, so this is session 3 of the Trusted CI Fellows Virtual Institute. Welcome, everybody. Just like to start real quick, if anyone has any logistical questions or travel questions or anything like that that they need an answer to.
I have one. So is there going to be a special activity on PERC related to this group?
Yes, there's a Trusted CI workshop, and the plan is to have the fellows who are able to make it to come there, and we'll have a session with all of us kind of describing to the participants in the workshop what the experience has been like and have a discussion, plus an opportunity for us to meet each other in person. And
awesome. Thank you.
Sure. I'll try to get the details of that into our notes soon. Any other questions or concerns? Okay. So if you are going to PERC, I recommend talking to Diana sooner rather than later. I hear their hotel rooms are filling up fast. Okay. So without further ado, we have a special guest speaker, Von Welch, who's going to talk about cybersecurity. So what is the goal of cybersecurity for science, and how is it different? And so with that, I'll turn it over to Von.
Hey, sharing my... Okay. I think everyone should be able to see my slide now, and sound good?
Sounds great. Great.
And I was hoping I could see the chat, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So Dana, I'll ask you to jump in if you see questions in the chat.
Will do. Okay.
So I'm going to talk a little bit this morning. This is going to be a little bit more of a philosophical talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what cybersecurity is and what the goal of cybersecurity is, and then some specifically about what cybersecurity for science is and why it's different than cybersecurity for banking or DoD or even enterprise IT, you know, for example, in most of our universities. And, you know, some of this is important because this underpins, you know, why does Trusted CI exist? Why are we out here trying to educate folks on these things? And why aren't we just, for example, for scientific research, you know, adopting some NIST standard off the shelf? And then I'll give a couple closing thoughts on cybersecurity. So just some terminology, you're going to hear me, I will probably shift back and forth between information security, computer security, cybersecurity. Don't try to read any distinction into them. This is just, I tend to use them more or less interchangeably. And if you use a term I don't know, you know, please just ask. So I like starting with this definition of what a CISO does. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, is the senior level executive in an organization, right? This is the person responsible for the vision, the strategy, you know, around cybersecurity. And so this is a definition off of Wikipedia, which I think is a pretty good one. I think most CISOs would agree with this. And so embedded in this is sort of the definition of cybersecurity, and it's around this phrase, you know, adequately protected. And so, of course, the key question is what the heck does adequately protected mean, right? Very subjective phrase, not terribly crisp. So let me start with talking about what it doesn't mean. And, you know, a common misconception is that it means reducing all risk to zero. And this particular image, which I really like, refers to there's an old joke in cybersecurity, which is it's really easy to secure a computer, right? You lock it in a safe and put it at the bottom of the ocean, and now it's completely secure, right? The joke being is it's also totally unusable, right? You reduce risk and you make it unusable. So, and I always like to point out, and this is a quote from Peter Drucker, a well-known management consultant, and I won't read it all to you, but basically, in a nutshell, what Peter is saying is, risk is inherent in any sort of endeavor. You can't undertake anything without adopting some risk. And so, just backing up the previous slide, so cybersecurity, sort of by definition, can't reduce risk to zero. And my last observation on this front is this is a slide that's kicked around the internet for so long, the genesis, but wonderfully funny slide. But I think it applies here because this is my analogy. Somebody tries to reduce the risk too much. What inevitably happens to them in higher ed, but I think a lot of different organizations, is they'll just get circumvented. So there's a real practical side to this too, right? If cybersecurity just starts seeing it if people in the organization just start seeing cybersecurity as a barrier, they're just going to go around it and it will cease to be effective. So this is, this kind of looks like math, and I wouldn't try to read it too much as calculus, but I think it conceptually gets at what cybersecurity is meant to do, which is balance risk versus mission. And I've written this here towards science, but the idea of what this says is, there's some cost of breaches and incidents. There's some cost of the cybersecurity program itself, and then there's the impact on science productivity from cybersecurity, right? So, I think it's a little simplistic to always say there's a trade-off of usability versus cybersecurity, but inherently cybersecurity does come with some impact, right? I mean, it would be great if we all didn't have to log in, but obviously that's taken as a not even debatable at this point, right, that we have to log in. Yes, it would be faster if we didn't have to. So, and the idea is you're looking to balance these things as the image sort of tries to show here. And so the idea is that you want to try to take the risks into account, take the science outcome, and try to keep them in relatively good amount of alignment, right? You need to achieve the science while minimizing the risks. And so cybersecurity really is best thought of as a form of risk management, right? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You have to accept some risk. And the real gist is in the center line here, which is to talk about the risk. Acknowledge that it's out there, think about it, and talk about the trade-offs. Just because, and I see this often from some cybersecurity folks, they see the risk side of things and they're completely focused on the risk side of things. And in reality, that risk is a trade-off with something that's being accomplished. The last bit of advice on the slide is we also tend to get a little bit hung up on the technology. And my advice is don't get too hung up on it. The technology is how you implement the risk management. So I always find it's very good to start the discussion at a risk management level, decide what the ideal risk trade-off is, and then you figure out how to implement that risk management with technology. Another thing that misconception that I find is out there is, isn't this just an IT problem? And frankly, this is often indicated. CISOs will very often report to a chief information officer or whatnot, and it sort of leads to us thinking that cybersecurity can all just be solved by the IT team. And I think this has some challenges. A lot of it tends to be, the implementation of the technology tends to play a big role, but I think this leads to the misconception. It's back to the notion that it's all of an IT problem. There's some trivial examples to this you see written down there. You know, some of it is not an IT problem, right? If someone can dumpster dive for your confidential information, it's broader than IT. Implying it's an IT problem also tends to imply sometimes a lack of awareness of the business mission, that focus on the risk instead of the business mission that I mentioned before. And so I like to sort of encourage people to think of it more broadly. This is back to the risk perspective. And then IT is often very involved in the management. So coming back to that question I asked a while ago, adequately protected, and what does that mean? And I'm going to give the usual caveated answer here, right? It depends. But a number of things that I've seen that the different organizations look at over time to determine this. First, sometimes you've got clear legal and financial risks. You know, if you're a bank, your cybersecurity is, it's very clear, right? People are out to steal money, right? So you've got very clear risks there. Sometimes if you're dealing with patient data, you may have HIPAA. HIPAA has financial risks associated with, right? So sometimes you've got clear, well-defined consequences. As I'll talk a little bit about in science, we often don't have these clear, well-defined consequences. We often have some ethical risks, and I'll give some examples of this, but you think about user privacy. If, a user data, let me just pick, I don't mean to pick on Facebook, but they're a good example, right? If Facebook's user database gets compromised, this is the privacy risk, which may in turn have business risk, right? But you see the path around that. Another thing that people tend to overlook is organizational maturity, which leads to a prioritization of risk. So think of an established product versus an established organization versus a startup, right? If you're a startup in Silicon Valley, your biggest risk is getting beaten to market. And so why people are always talking about building cybersecurity in early, the reality is a new startup that is having to rush to establish itself in the market often cannot put the priority on cybersecurity because their business mission will fail. On the other hand, if you're IBM or another blue chip at this point, Microsoft, Google, etc., right, you're established and people have much higher expectations of you for cybersecurity. So your risk tolerance based on these things is going to be very different. And looking at science and research, we see this really starkly if you compare our central IT organizations versus research projects, right? Central IT organizations see themselves as an arm of universities. Universities have been around for a century or more, right? They're well established. They're very concerned about their reputation. Research projects are much more akin to startups, right? They just got a grant. They've got 3 years to produce. They need to get off and running, right? So you can see this huge cultural tension between the two. History is often, if you've been bitten by something, you'll find an organization is twice shy. Sometimes there's cultural differences. There are different groups that are just more or less risk tolerant. Some folks are just more concerned about having control. Others are just more willing to take risks. So different organizations will just have different tolerances. And then there's the outside world. The environment and threat landscape is constantly changing. If we go back 10 years before ransomware, hospitals were not big targets for cyber attacks. Now they are. So they've had to incredibly adjust what adequate protection means over the past decade. And some of that is true for science research projects as well. So key mission in all this is cybersecurity must be cognizant of the mission of the institution, right? You can't sort of do cybersecurity off in a bubble working with just the IT group. It has to be aware of the mission of the institution, all the different risk tolerances. The other thing I will argue for, there's two definitions up here from Merriam-Webster about cybersecurity. The second one, number 4 from Merriam-Webster, is what we often tend to think about, right? It's measures to guard against attackers, shortly. The first one is broader, right? It's being freedom from danger and mission. And I think we oftentimes just get hung up on the number 4, which I think is somewhat justified. I mean, that's where a lot of the urgency comes from. But if you think about number 1, we have a lot of threats to our IT that aren't necessarily coming from attackers. You know, we can have well-meaning users accidentally expose data. We can have IT failures that expose data or cause data to be lost or cause integrity errors. So just another thing that I like to see folks keep in balance. So in practice, the way I encourage people to think about things is it's impossible because of all these reasons to pick a perfect course for cybersecurity, right? Your risks, your risk landscapes, your risk tolerances are going to change. And sort of hence you think of cybersecurity as a program that you're constantly adjusting your state of, you know, you assess the risk you're under, you assess your tolerance, and you adjust as you go along. I think that's a good pause point. Is there?
There is a question.
Yeah.
Whose responsibility is it in the research institution to decide the risk tolerances?
Oh, that is a great question, and it's a question that many institutions or research projects don't really have well defined. So ultimately, I think in an institution, it's got to come all the way from the top. You know, ultimately, there's got to be leader. You know, the highest level of leadership has to decide what level of risk that they're going to accept. Whether that's a really formal process or not, because otherwise, here's the problem: if you make the CISO both the decider on risk and the implementer of risk risk mitigation, the incentives are misaligned because they become responsible for any cyber attacks that succeed, and they become responsible for the risk decisions. All of their incentives are to drive risk to zero, right? To be really risk averse. So you have to have the higher level involved in making that decision between the two organizations. Now, having said that, I think many organizations fail to do that, but I believe that's absolutely key. I also see a question, looks like this came privately to me, but I'm going to guess that was a mistake. Is this science or research talking about here and not DoD or HIPAA? And I'll touch on that here in just a minute. So let me, actually that's my first slide here. So I want to talk a little bit about regulated versus open science. And so as I mentioned before, some research with regulated data or sometimes contractual data use agreements or, you know, is guided by clear compliance measures, right? If you're working with patient data, you've got HIPAA, which for better or for worse, kind of tells you exactly what you want to do or what you should do. There's some flexibility in that, particularly for HIPAA, less so for FISMA, this 171. On contrast, a lot of what I'm going to call open science here is not guided by compliance, right? If you do astronomy, science, physics, geology, biology, you know, there's not a clear mandate here for what you should be doing. And my observation is if you're at a university, a sizable fraction is going to be that open science, particularly outside of the medical school. The medical school will tend to probably do a lot of HIPAA. The rest of the university will tend to maybe have pockets where you've got export control or other things, but does not. I'm going to largely focus on open science in this talk. We've got talks that I can share, and probably I think we've got a talk later in the Institute, which I'll bring in somebody to talk about the HIPAA and the regulated data. But I'm going to focus on the open science. Part it's a little bit more challenging because it's not as well defined. So the first myth about cybersecurity for science that I see is the conflation of confidentiality and the need for cybersecurity. So if you think about most of the headlines that you see about cybersecurity involve breaches. So it's private data that gets exposed. And so we tend to conflate cybersecurity with the need for confidentiality. And I'll walk through some of the other reasons why this is true. This is not true for science. But to sort of give you one of the big differences here is science tends to have a stronger need, I would argue, for integrity and availability as opposed to confidentiality, which is very different than, say, the financial sector. Yeah, so question here from Anshul. I've heard of the CIA. So this is, for those of you who've been involved in cybersecurity, there's a paradigm, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which helps frame conversations about cybersecurity. Are any of these more or less relevant? And yes, I'll talk a little bit about this, but I think with open science, integrity and availability tend to be the more important, as opposed to confidentiality, which tends to be much more important in other areas. So I like to frame the discussion for cybersecurity for science in terms of trusted, open, and reproducible results. And the slide is confusing me. Pardon me just a second. Oh, this is right. Okay. All right. Sorry for just a second there. I thought I had grabbed an old presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is integrity. And so by integrity tends to be a little bit of a broad word here. You can get into research integrity at some very high levels where you're talking about ethics. I'm really talking here about data integrity, which tends to be more the concern of cybersecurity, right? And what I see for a lot of open science is a strong need for data integrity as being an important aspect, as opposed to confidentiality for other areas. The other thing to note is I mentioned ransomware for hospitals. For those of you who are not familiar with ransomware, it's a particular form of malware or malicious software that encrypts your data and then holds it for ransom, and you don't get your data back until you pay. And you notice what's particularly insidious about this is prior to ransomware, your data had to have value to the criminals. It had to be something that they could use. So for example, it had to be, identity theft where they could turn around and use your identity to get money, or it had to be something like credit cards they could turn around and sell or use. But with ransomware, they have changed the economics such that all the data has to do is be valuable to you. And so this really broadened the set of potential victims to include hospitals and researchers and even municipalities, right? We've seen a lot more hospitals and cities fall victim to cybercrime since ransomware has come onto the scene. Reproducibility, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but reproducibility is an emerging area, and it has a reliance on cybersecurity just for the sake that, if our computer systems are, under the control of attackers, we're rolling the dice with respect to reproducibility. So let me talk science productivity, and walk through productivity, trustworthiness, and reproducibility in a little more detail. So one key aspect of science is, we have in certain domains, particularly, we don't always know when events are going to occur that we want to study. Great example here of some astronomers in Australia nearly missing an event because of a virus attack here. So we've got a key, case where we need to keep things available because we don't control everything that goes on in the natural world that we want to study. We also have, I mentioned before, this difference in life cycle. We have research projects that tend to be short-lived, and they need to progress quickly. This is very, very different than, say, our home universities. And it's common for research collaborations to span multiple universities and countries. And what's key about this is, unlike other things that happen at our universities, where there may be a group defined in our central HR database or our directory, researchers want to define their own teams. And so they want to have support for these collaborations in ways that aren't defined by their university's structure. And cyber infrastructure, that is infrastructure we use for research, is not enterprise IT. And just some examples up here, most enterprise InfoSec folks are really shocked when we talk about researchers having secure shell, command line access to systems, shocked that we're running code and virtual machines provided by researchers. These are not something that central IT tends to do outside of the research space. Science gateways and science DMZs, we'll talk about these, but these are essentially applications of standard web portals and network infrastructure to support high performance. And we do have that. We run lots of, in order to support the large data and computational needs, we tend to have lots of distributed high performance file systems, networks, et cetera, in ways that, that stress traditional enterprise IT. Jay asks, is there any data to show how many academic cyber infrastructure is run like enterprise IT? Not sure I understand the question, Jay. How many? Can you perhaps?
Yeah, so my question is that you mentioned about, I agree with you, cyber infrastructure is not equal to enterprise IT. So I say academic could be research, open science. My impression is that universities are more and more like running like an industry, right? Like enterprise, including the IT area. So my feeling is that this is close to 100%, if not pushing towards 100%. You are suggesting running the other direction. So I just want to get a sense. Are you seeing that the business group is trying to push towards the enterprise IT and your suggestion trying the other direction?
Right.
How would that work out?
So I don't have a firm number for you, and Dana may have a really good perspective on this in addition to mine. What I've learned to look for is if a university has a research computing group or a research supporting center in either under the IT organization or sometimes under the vice chancellor or vice president for research. And that will indicate a group that is running infrastructure aimed at research. I think without the presence of such a group is usually a pretty good sign that they're going to be running things more like your traditional enterprise IT. Dana, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think just in general, like a rough poll is about half of research computing centers are in IT and about half are not, usually in the research under the vice president for research. And even when it's in enterprise IT, it's not run exactly the same, right? So in enterprise IT, if email goes down or if payroll goes down, people get fired or in big trouble. Those things have to be very resilient. Whereas in research computing, researchers want lots of cheap computers to use. Like if in a high performance computing cluster, all the compute nodes, you never put redundant power supplies or redundant anything because you just want more and more compute. And so it tends to have not, you know, you don't need as much uptime. And also, just like here, you know, you're letting people have shell access to the shared machine. And so that typically drives enterprise IT folks crazy, just because the researchers themselves who have user access can actually break the infrastructure. And so it's a bit of a different model and a bit of a different mindset than typical enterprise IT. Although as cyber infrastructure becomes more and more essential to so many kinds of research, it seems like it's moving more into the direction of, you know, not ever going down. But I could go on that for quite some time. But
yeah. I like your example about the availability tolerance, Dana. I agree with that. Researchers tend to be more tolerant of hardware that isn't maybe as 100% as in the enterprise. Jay asks the follow-up question: if there are any references we can share, and I'll send some out in email afterwards. Jay, I should have included them in my talk, but there's at least some articles we've written and some other presentations we've given on this. So we should pull that together.
yeah, and Henry Neiman has a good slide deck on how research IT is not like enterprise IT I can share.
Oh, that would be excellent. We should actually collect that on our website, thinking about it. Okay. The other point I'd like to make is reputational harm. And this has actually been increasing slowly over the past couple years, where if we in the research community basically aren't seen as having our act together, we risk somebody coming in and dictating to us how we should do cybersecurity, which I think is very unlikely to go well, because of some of the reasons that I've talked about prior to now. We'll have cybersecurity that does not support well the science mission. So, I think this is another key challenge that we need to deal with. Confidential data and human and open science, and I'll just mention these. Even in the most open science, we tend to have pre-publication, pre-announcement, maybe data that hasn't been quality assured yet. We have examples of ethical concerns. This is one of my favorite examples, Dr. Tanya Wolf-Berger's Wildbook project. She does, uses AI to do visual identification of individual animals, right? So you can track migration patterns. This comes with, photos that she collects from tourists, rangers, etc. And they're very concerned about geolocation of endangered species falling into the hands of poachers. So a couple closing thoughts here. So one of the things often comes up in cybersecurity is a discussion of baseline controls versus risk management. So I'm just going to share my philosophy real quick on the end of this. So baseline controls, I think, they get some bad rap sometimes, but I think they're a great way to get going quickly, right? I think they address 80% of the problems at 80% of the time, sort of thing. The challenges are they don't work well for everything. So particularly in the science space, right, trying to apply baseline controls to telescopes and things that are unique to the science mission tends to be too rigid. And so there really needs to be some way to allow for exceptions. On the flip side, people often then talk about risk assessments, right? And I won't go into details on risk assessments, but in general, what you do is you start looking at all the different ways harms can occur. You rate those on a scale here, like you see on the left-hand side of this image. And then this sort of guides you as to where to put your risk mitigation. It's a really challenging procedure. It really requires, it's very subjective in the end, right? I mean, gauging risk, unless you've got something that is obviously going to happen or obviously very rare, there's a lot of stuff in the middle. How likely are you to be attacked by ransomware in the next year? Very subjective question. So this requires expertise and can be overwhelming if you try to apply it to an entire organization, right? If you go from first principles on risk assessment you will spend a lot of time doing a risk assessment. So I always like to push for what I call the cake view on this.
Questions, Vaughn.
Yeah, let me finish this slide, and I think actually that will do it, and I'll hit the questions.
Okay.
So the argument I like to put forward is a base of controls is a really good place to start for almost everybody. And then think of risk assessment as your frosting, right? This will cover gaps in your base controls and let you assess exceptions. So in other words, it's better to roll the base controls out and then think about making exceptions to your base controls or covering things that don't. So just a little bit of discussion there. So cool. Questions. Let's see, I think Matthias had the first one. How is this communicated to users? I think it's so the AUP you mentioned in there, Matthias, tends to be the major form of communication of cybersecurity to users. I don't think of AUPs as being a silver bullet. By the way, AUPs, for those who aren't familiar with it, stands for Acceptable Use Agreement or Acceptable Use Policies. So this will be something usually when you first sign up for a service, you'll often see it called terms and conditions or something that you have to agree to. A lot of research infrastructure, you'll see this. I think if you go to Exceed, you'll have an AUP that you have to agree to. And usually what it does is it's a little bit more practical, right? It lays out for the researcher what their obligations are, right? They won't share their password. They won't use the computing resources to mine Bitcoin, right? Those sorts of things. So it tends to be a little bit more on the implementation side of it. I don't think in general, I think a lot of I don't think I've seen an AUP that really tries to convey, hey, this is a research infrastructure, it's different than enterprise, because I think people, the organizations tend to assume that almost, which I'm not arguing is right, but I think that's the case.
But I was right. I was referring about the reliability of the services. You say you assume because it's a research facility, but on the other hand, it's not reading anywhere how what the expectations are for this system to be running 100% all the time.
Yeah.
Well, so it depends on the size of the center, right? How long, like at Oklahoma State, when we first started, it was, one person and 19 users who previously had their computational resources in their closets. And so they somewhat understood that this, they were getting what they paid for, so to speak. So the expectations start fairly low in the first place. For instance, parallel file systems, if you look at all the supercomputers across the country, the number one reason why they go down is the parallel file systems are just, for years and years were not that robust. They could go down fairly easily just because, they can't handle tens of millions of small files or various other things. And it's when you're, a lot of people understand that when you're on the cutting edge or an early adopter, right? If you're the first person to download the Windows update, you're taking a risk. It's better to wait 3 days and see how everybody else complains first. And then also you end up doing stuff like when they apply for their account, you put all caps, bold-faced, your files are not backed up, you must have this backed up elsewhere, somewhere, and try to set the user expectations. I think that's one of the big things is managing expectations. And then when if they want to understand, like, why can't it be safer or have more availability or all these things, you explain to them that the cost goes up sometimes by an order of magnitude, right? And so the question is, do you want to have access to 10 computers that go down, that are maybe offline for 2 or 3 days a year? Or would you rather just have one computer to use, but have it be up all the time? And so that's the trade-off in managing expectations you do in research computing, because generally, most universities still, they're, scraping for dollars. And so And it depends, right? If your research is super important, like we used to tell people, it's like, this is research computing. Like if you need your database to be online all the time, then put it in the cloud or someplace else that has much higher uptime.
Thank you.
Sorry, I need to unmute. Anshul asked about different models, frameworks to do risk assessment. Kind of like, you know, the one I showed on slide 34. To answer your question, yes, there are lots of framework and models. NIST has one in, I think it's 853, but don't quote me on that. The Center for Internet Security, who does the top 20 control sets that I referenced, also has one. And frankly, there's a lot of Excel spreadsheet driven risk management systems out there at different groups that have done their own. They all basically share the same guidance that, you know, it's basically a grid of, you know, of different types of risks versus their likelihood, and then you use some sort of fuzzy math to multiply these things together, right? The more likely it is, the more catastrophic the consequences, the higher the prioritization, right? So they all kind of share this. Some are a little bit more focused on a particular area. Others are very generic. I will probably not say too much more than that. To be honest with you, I am not an expert in all the different risk assessments. To be say that careful, there are dragons there. You can start it seems conceptually simple, but you'll find out what it provides you is it's a little bit of a way to structure your thinking and give you some hints as to prioritization. But you quickly find out it doesn't help you with, so for example, you may find out one risk is really catastrophic because it's probably, you know, medium likely, really high consequences, but then you find out the mitigations are really, really, really expensive, right? So you have to sort of work everything through. It doesn't give you as clean answers as you would like. It's a good way to sort of structure your risk assessment thinking. But it won't give you, you know, it doesn't output, you know, a to-do list. Assuming there are several models, frameworks, is there consistency across organizations? Yes, the first order, some of the language is the same. There tends to be a lot of subjectivity in the judgment. So they may apply it, but as you know, deciding on the likelihood is not a science. It's more of an art. Also deciding on the consequences can vary. Has anybody done a comparative analysis to see if provide similar assessments? That's a good question, and I don't know, Anshul, is the short answer. It wouldn't surprise me, but I haven't looked for that particular bit of research. And Jay, in your opinion, how should open cybersecurity address the use of open platforms for sharing? Overleaf, Google, Dropbox, etc. Is this something different, should be handled different than enterprise IT? You know, the main concern that I see that enterprise IT and institutions have about these open platforms for sharing tends to be somewhat bureaucratic, in that once data goes onto those platforms, they've technically shared it with a third party. So if you're dealing with something like HIPAA data, which, you know, really has requirements, right? If I have HIPAA data and I share it with a third party, I'm actually have to have what's called a business associate agreement in place with that third party, or I've violated HIPAA. And so a lot of what you see central organizations pushing back on the use of these open platforms, and even things like email providers like Gmail, right? Here at IU, you know, staff are not supposed to use Gmail because they're really worried somebody will email HIPAA protected data around, and then once it's, you know, on a cloud, you know, one of these open platform providers, you now technically have a breach, right? Even if it hasn't done it, it's been shared with an unauthorized third party. So a lot of the concerns about those things, just to realize, tend to come from that bureaucratic process, and it's another organization. Otherwise, the biggest risk that I've seen from these sharing platforms, which is something we've struggled with Entrusted CI, is honestly the access control list can get very complicated. Try sticking a Google Doc into an existing Google folder that's been shared with other people, and figure, and you start seeing sometimes unexpected things happening with access control. So a lot of these things can get a little bit complicated to manage access control around. And then the final thing that I'll mention is then ownership of these things. If somebody leaves the project, this can cause some real pain. So there's some issues there with these, but it's around these things that they don't tend to be owned by an institution, so they can be a little difficult to manage. I don't know of any formal written study on this. We've done some our own work with Inside Trusted CI dealing with this, that we worked with others. We've actually gone as far as to have discussions with Google about some of the challenges that we've seen using Google Docs. No, I have not seen NSF come up with any recommendations for data management for these open platforms. It's typical with NSF, they like to require you have a data management plan, but they leave the details up to you and the review committee to decide if they're acceptable on. Should Trusted CI come up with one? I think I'm very close to saying yes as soon as I think we have the answers, to be honest with you. We're looking right now, so we use Google Docs internally a great deal. Frankly, we're accepting some risks on that. We've had problems when people leave the project and all of a sudden the ownership of their files. I mean, this creates challenges for us. We're starting to look some. Google now has, I think it's Google Drive for Teams that we're starting to look at, that we're hoping will solve some of these, but it's still an open question in my mind. So I think, yes, some guidance is needed, but I don't think we quite know what the answers are yet. So
I want to make a comment. I think that this is my experience. Whether it's HIPAA, right? HIPAA, of course, is a lot more serious, but there are other cases where, let's say I sign an agreement with users to share data with us so that we can publish the research paper. The agreement is already there. However, that my students, myself, were using Overleaf, right, to write this draft LaTeX paper. So like you said, it's a third-party agreement already there, right? So before it become published, because it's become reviewed and everything become vetted by whoever need to say this is okay, Overleaf already have our draft. And someone, I mean, Overleaf themselves, but if someone hack to Overleaf, right, they got all of our stuff. And the students are very easily collaborating on Overleaf. GitHub is another one, right? So all of those things, I think there's a lot more than just Google Doc. A lot of platforms that beyond what I'm aware. And this is just popping up very rapidly. So that's why I was thinking about for open science community, which is your focus. I don't know who can come up with a recommendation, and whether recommendation by the time you come up with it, whether there be some other problem popping up. So this is just like other cybersecurity problems where it's catching up again, right? So that's just my thought, and I don't have a solution either.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of a hairy problem, and it may be one of these cases where all you can do is try to educate people on the risks. I think most institutions of higher education have gone through a process where at some point they look at their network traffic to see what services their faculty and staff are using, and the answer almost always comes up all of them, right? So people are kind of doing this already for various reasons, and I think it's a real challenge. Right? Sometimes you see this in the private sector. They will block this stuff technically at the border, right? They take a heavy-handed approach to the risk management here. And you can kind of imagine how that would go over with faculty and researchers, right, in our world, right? So clearly there's some trade-offs to be made. Well, thank you all. Really, really good questions. I look forward next week. You'll get a different perspective on this from Tom Barton, which I'm really looking forward to myself. So, Dana, anything else? If not, I think I'm wrapped up.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Vaughn. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions.
Dana and Vaughn, I have another question, a suggestion perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just relate to that recommendation for data management plan. And a lot of us write as a proposals. One of the things that I asked our sponsor research on the data management plan as we move forward, there isn't any really good draft, good template about addressing this more open platform kind of usage. I was wondering that your university, whether your site have anything like that was, okay, here's one very good write-ups about how to address that. If you have something like that, would you be able to share? If not, that's fine, just asking. I think that would be very valuable for the community. Say, this is how you should think about, at least these are the elements you should think about to manage your data.
Yeah, I can pull together a few resources. There's a couple places that help put together those templates, because it's so dependent on the discipline. It's hard to make one that's very widespread, usable. And in a lot of institutions, you'll find the folks working on these things are in the library. So, curation and stewardship of things is kind of their bread and butter. So it's another group to collaborate with in working through all of these issues.
I'll actually send you out Trusted CI's DMP. I think you'll find it highly unsatisfactory. We talk about using some of the open stuff for collaboration, but to be honest, and later on in the Institute, I'm going to have Jim Marsteller who's actually going to talk to you about Trusted CI's cybersecurity program. So we'll talk about in more detail some of the things that we do there regarding security with our use of Google Docs, for example. Dana, you see the request about PERC? Maybe my suggestion would be is we get something out in an email to everybody about that.
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to attend it as much as they can, just because it's a great conference and a lot to learn and people to be around. But if you have, other conflicts and things like that, just talk to Vaughn and I and Diana about that.
I'll second that. What's the strength of PERC is as far as I know, it's the best sort of gathering of folks in the research CI space from as many different perspectives as possible, right? So it's very broad, lots of different people, a good mixture of scientists and the CI operators. So it's just a good opportunity to make connections and to get an overview.
They haven't published the full schedule yet, but they do have the workshops. There's a link that I could send to the group to at least give you an idea of the types of things that will be discussed.
That would be great.
Okay. Well, I'll thank you everyone for your attention today, and look forward to seeing everyone and along with Tom next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Dana, can I see the kitty one more time before I go?
Hold on.
Yeah, I second that.
Yeah, Dana, they were playing behind you as I was talking. It's pretty darn distracting.
Oh, this is virtual therapy. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Thank you.
I could watch this all day.
Next week.
Thank you. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.